He thought he had met a beautiful woman on the prairie and followed her into the forest. But what awaited him in her hut was not what he had imagined. Fate caught up with him where he least expected it. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The sun hung heavy in the western sky, burning the plains into shades of gold and red. The prairie stretched wide in every direction, a sea of brittle grass that whispered in the wind and shivered with the restless passage of insects. Dust rose with each step of the horse that carried Thomas Reed onward, a weary figure bent under the long miles of trail. He had not bathed in days. The sweat had caked into his clothes, and the brim of his hat sagged with the weight of dust and sweat. He rode not as a man with a purpose, but as one pursued by memories too heavy to carry, yet impossible to leave behind. Thomas was a cowboy, but not of the kind sung about in cheap songs by traveling minstrels. He was a hired gun, a man who had gone wherever gold pointed him. For years he had drifted between cattle drives, lawless skirmishes, and jobs that left more corpses than coin in his pockets. Yet nothing weighed on him so much as the deed his companions had carried out only days before, the taking of a child from a native village at the edge of the frontier. Thomas had been there, standing guard with a rifle in his hands, while others ripped the boy from his mother's arms. He had not raised his weapon against the villagers, but the echo of their cries had followed him into every mile since. He tried to tell himself that it was not his plan, not his choice, that he had merely followed orders, but his conscience did not accept the lie. As the afternoon waned, the prairie seemed endless, as though it might swallow him whole. He rode with one hand slack on the reins, the other resting near the revolver at his hip. It was not out of habit alone, but from the unease that had dogged him since that night. He feared shadows, the possibility of revenge, the chance that someone would come hunting. The frontier had no shortage of widows and orphans seeking vengeance, and Thomas knew too well that one day his sins would return to meet him face to face. Ahead, near a low stream that cut across the grassland, he saw movement. At first, he thought it was an animal come to drink, perhaps a deer or a stray horse. But as he drew nearer, he realized it was a figure. A young woman kneeling by the water, cupping her hands to drink. She rose slowly, turning toward him with an ease that startled him. Most settlers or natives would have fled at the sight of an armed rider, alone on the prairie. But she did not move away. Her dark hair fell loose down her back, catching the light in glossy strands. Her dress was simple, made of leather and cloth adorned with beads that shimmered faintly. She stood with the stillness of one who belonged wholly to the land around her, and her eyes, black as night, held a calm that made his breath catch. Thomas slowed his horse, uncertain. She watched him without lowering her gaze, as though she knew him already, or as though she had been expecting someone. The air grew tense, heavy with something unspoken. He felt a stirring within him, not only of desire but of fear. For weeks he had seen nothing but the faces of his companions and the emptiness of the land. And now, in the sudden presence of this young woman, all his senses came alive. She did not speak. Instead, she bent once more to the water and, in a gesture that carried both simplicity and meaning, scooped a handful and let it fall in a thin stream to the earth. Then she lifted her chin and glanced toward the line of trees that bordered the prairie. The movement was slight, but it drew him as surely as if she had spoken aloud. He dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the soft earth of the bank. He approached her warily, his heart pounding with the mix of suspicion and yearning. She remained unafraid. Her eyes traveled over him, taking in the dust-stained clothes, the tired horse, the lines of a man worn thin by the trail. She seemed to weigh him, to measure something unseen. When she turned and began walking toward the shadowed woods, she did not look back, but her pace was unhurried, deliberate, as though she trusted he would follow. Thomas hesitated. Every instinct told him to remain on the open prairie, where the sky was wide and the dangers visible. The woods promised uncertainty, shadow, and perhaps death. Yet another part of him, the part that longed for relief from his loneliness, the part that wanted to feel human again, drove him after her. He tied his horse loosely near the stream and stepped into the grass, following her footprints as she crossed into the tree line. As the prairie faded behind him, the air shifted. It grew cooler, damper, the scent of pine and earth rising to meet him. Branches whispered above, filtering the light into fractured beams. He felt as though he had crossed into another world, one where the rules of the trail no longer applied. The woman moved ahead with the grace of one who knew the land as an extension of her own body, her steps silent, her posture unbent. Thomas followed more clumsily, his spurs catching against roots, his boots sinking into damp soil. His thoughts churned as he walked. Why had she not fled? Why did she lead him deeper into the woods with such assurance? He tried to dismiss his doubts by focusing on her figure, on the sway of her hair, on the subtle allure of her presence. But underneath desire lay unease. He could not shake the memory of that boy being carried off, nor the suspicion that fate had brought him here for reasons far darker than he dared imagine. The woods thickened around them, and the prairie became only a memory of heat and dust behind him. The sound of the stream faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. He felt the weight of silence pressing down, broken only by the soft rhythm of their steps. He wanted to speak, to demand her name, her purpose, but something in her quiet dignity silenced him. He told himself that this was nothing more than chance, that she was a girl from a nearby village, curious about a stranger. Perhaps she sought company, perhaps more. He clung to that thought, though deep down he knew better. He was a man hunted by his past, and the past had a way of finding its shape in the present. At last she paused, standing at the edge of a narrow clearing. Through the trees, Thomas could see a faint glow, the promise of firelight against the gathering dusk. She looked at him then, her expression unreadable, before continuing forward. He followed, heart heavy with both longing and dread. And so, with each step, Thomas Reed walked deeper into a fate he could not yet name, led onward by the quiet figure of a woman who had appeared to him like a vision on the prairie, but whose path would drag him into the shadows he had long feared. The forest swallowed him slowly, like the mouth of a beast closing in silence behind its prey. The prairie, with its wide horizon and burning sky, faded into memory as the canopy closed overhead and dimmed the evening light. Thomas Reed felt the shift in his bones as much as in his eyes. The air cooled, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, clinging to his skin after the dry heat of the plains. The woman moved before him without hesitation, her steps sure and silent, as if she had traced this path 100 times. He followed with less grace, boots sinking into soft patches of soil, spurs clinking against stones hidden under leaves. The sound of his presence seemed louder than it should have been, an intrusion in a world that did not welcome him. The deeper they walked, the more the silence pressed. At first it was only the rustling of leaves, the distant cry of a bird settling for the night, the faint trickle of unseen streams. But as the light dimmed, even those small comforts seemed to retreat. The forest became a cathedral of shadows, each tree a pillar, each dark hollow a place where secrets waited. Thomas felt the weight of unseen eyes, though whether they belonged to animals or men he could not tell. Every instinct urged him to turn back, to return to his horse and the open land, yet he pressed onward. His mind wandered unwillingly to the boy. He remembered the small form, bound and crying, as the men dragged him from his mother. The child's eyes had burned into his memory, wide and terrified, as if they saw more than just the men who held him. Thomas had done nothing to stop it, though he had not laid hands on the boy himself. He had stood with his rifle, guarding against interference, while the screams of the women and the curses of the men filled the night. He had told himself it was not his fight, that the gang would not spare him if he resisted. Yet here, in the silence of the forest, the memory felt heavier than it had under the stars of that night. He tried to shake it away, but it clung like smoke to his skin. The woman glanced back at him once, her dark eyes reflecting what little light remained. It was not a look of fear, nor of invitation, but of certainty. She knew where she was going, and she knew he would follow. That knowledge chilled him more than her silence. He realized then that he had told her more than he should have, where he had come from, the places his companions camped, the trail they had taken. His words had slipped out too easily, softened by the strange calm she inspired. Now he wondered if she had intended it all along, drawing his tongue loose with nothing more than her presence. They pressed deeper. Branches clawed at his sleeves, roots snagged his boots. The horse he had left at the stream seemed a world away. He began to feel the forest itself was tightening around him, narrowing his choices with every step. He tried to convince himself that he was still in control, that he could turn back at any moment. But he knew it was not true. He was caught in the pull of something larger than his own will, something that had begun the moment he saw her by the water. The clearing came at last, sudden and quiet, as though the forest had parted just enough to reveal it. At its center stood a cabin of rough-hewn logs, small and weathered, leaning slightly under the weight of years. The roof sagged in places where moss clung thick, and the walls bore the marks of storms and seasons. Yet smoke rose from a crooked chimney, faint but steady, curling upward into the twilight sky. Firelight glimmered faintly through the cracks in the shutters, a heartbeat of warmth within the gloom. Thomas stopped at the edge of the clearing. His heart thudded in his chest, not from the walk, but from the weight of dread that settled on him. Something about the cabin felt wrong, though he could not name it. Perhaps it was the silence that hung too heavily over the clearing, as though even the birds dared not intrude. Perhaps it was the certainty in the woman's step as she moved toward the door, never once hesitating, as though she had led him here for a purpose she did not need to explain. He thought of turning back, of running into the trees and forcing his way to the prairie again. But he knew it was too late. He had followed too far, given too much of himself. His desire for her company, for the escape she had offered from his loneliness, had drawn him here like a moth to flame. And now, standing at the threshold of this cabin in the woods, he felt the shadows of his past closing in. The woman paused at the door and laid her hand on the rough wood. The firelight within flickered, casting her silhouette against the dim glow. She did not look at him, nor did she beckon, yet he felt compelled to follow. His boots dragged against the earth as he stepped forward, each pace heavier than the last. He could almost hear the voices of his companions, laughing as they rode away with the child, boasting of the money they would demand. He remembered the silence that followed, the sound of a mother's grief filling the night. The cabin loomed larger with every step. The smoke from the chimney stung his nose, carrying with it the bitter scent of burning resin. The door creaked faintly in the breeze, as if impatient to open. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the coolness of the air. He told himself again that he was free to turn away, that nothing bound him to this path. But deep inside, he knew it was a lie. He had crossed a threshold long before reaching the cabin, and there was no returning. When he reached the woman, she pushed the door open slowly. The light inside spilled out in a warm glow that only deepened the shadows around it. For a moment, he stood at the edge, torn between the safety of the night behind him and the uncertainty of the firelit room ahead. The forest whispered faintly, a last reminder of escape, but he ignored it. With a final breath, Thomas stepped across the threshold. The door closed behind him with a hollow sound, sealing him into the cabin. The fire crackled low, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. The air inside was thick with smoke and the scent of sweat and wood. He felt the weight of unseen presence, a tension that hung like a veil in the room. His skin prickled. His instincts screamed, but he did not yet understand. It was only then, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, that he sensed the cabin was not empty. The first breath Thomas drew inside the cabin was heavy with smoke and resin, filling his lungs with an acrid taste that clung to the back of his throat. The glow of the fire at once revealed and concealed the interior, lighting the rough beams overhead while casting long shadows into the corners, where his eyes struggled to adjust. He felt the oppressive silence of the place pressing down upon him, yet the silence did not last. From the darkness around the fire, shapes began to emerge. They were men, broad-shouldered and grim, their faces marked with paint that caught the flicker of the flames. There were 4 of them, perhaps more, their movements purposeful and slow, like predators circling a kill. Before Thomas could draw breath enough to understand, strong hands seized his arms. The weight of the attack was overwhelming. One struck him hard across the chest, knocking the air from him. Another ripped the revolver from his belt and flung it aside. He staggered, tried to resist, but the force of their assault was greater than any fight he had left in him. The woman who had led him here stood apart, her expression transformed from the calm serenity at the stream into something harder, colder, resolute. In her eyes there was no trace of invitation, only judgment. He was driven to the floor, his back striking the packed earth with such violence that his vision swam. Rope bound his wrists before he could catch his breath, the coarse fibers biting into his skin until blood welled beneath. A boot pressed down on his chest, holding him as still as a pinned animal. The fire popped and spat, its glow illuminating the sharp edges of knives and the iron rods heating in the flames. The realization struck him with a clarity so sharp it hurt more than the blows. He had been led here not by chance nor by fortune, but by design. The woman had known who he was. She had guided him into the heart of a snare, set for him alone. The memory of the boy returned, vivid as though it had happened an hour ago. The small hands clawing at the air, the sound of his mother's voice breaking into despair. Thomas knew then, without need for words, that the boy was hers, her brother perhaps, taken by the men with whom Thomas had ridden. The men spoke among themselves in low, guttural tones he could not follow, yet their meaning was unmistakable. Their eyes burned with hatred, their gestures deliberate as they prepared the implements of torment. The heated iron hissed as it rested against the stones near the fire. A knife's edge glimmered, catching the light like a shard of ice. Thomas felt sweat bead along his skin, though the air was cool within the cabin. He strained against the ropes until his wrists ached, but the knots held fast. The first blow came swift, a strike to his jaw that sent blood spilling from his lip. Another followed to his ribs, sharp pain bursting through his chest. The men worked without haste, each strike measured, as though the pain itself was a language they intended him to understand. He gasped, coughed, tried to cling to the thought that he might still survive if he gave them something of use. Yet even as the thought rose, another followed. What could he give them but betrayal of the men he had ridden with? And what worth was his own life if he bought it at the cost of cowardice? The woman moved closer, her shadow stretching across his body where he lay. She carried no weapon, yet her presence was sharper than any blade. He saw in her expression a certainty that shook him more deeply than the pain. She knew what he had done. She knew the part he had played. To her, he was not a man misled by circumstance, but a thief of innocence, a guard who had stood watch while others carried away her blood. The torture deepened. The iron was lifted from the fire, glowing red and pressed against his arm. The searing pain tore a scream from his throat, filling the cabin with the sound of his agony. The smell of burnt flesh mingled with smoke until he could scarcely breathe. His vision blurred with tears that would not fall, his body trembling against the bonds. Each time he thought the pain might kill him, they drew back only to begin anew. Hours seemed to pass, though he could not mark the time. Between the blows and the burns, between the knives that traced shallow cuts across his skin, his mind drifted. Images of the past surfaced with cruel clarity. His first day as a drifter, the men he had followed for coin, the moment he chose silence over conscience when the boy was taken. He tried to remember the sound of laughter, of simple things that once filled his days, but every memory turned back to the child's cry. In that agony, he began to understand that his torment was more than punishment. It was judgment, a reckoning long overdue. The men surrounding him were not merely avengers. They were the voices of all he had ignored, the lives trampled under the hooves of the gang's horses, the silence he had kept when he might have spoken. The woman's eyes held him more fiercely than the ropes, as though she weighed each scream, each confession that slipped from him. At some point, he ceased to struggle. His body lay slack, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. Pain had become the very air he drew in. He no longer wondered when it would end, but whether it mattered. What was left of his life beyond this night, beyond these walls? Even if they freed him, he would carry the scars of guilt carved deeper than the flesh they had burned. The fire burned lower, shadows stretching longer, but the men did not relent. They worked with the patience of those who believed in their cause, and in their eyes Thomas read the certainty of his doom. The ropes cut deeper with each convulsion, blood soaking the fibers. He thought of calling out, of begging, but pride held his tongue, mingled with the faintest spark of defiance. If they wanted him broken, they would have to tear him to pieces. Yet even in the pit of torment, a thought crept into him, unwelcome and persistent. He could give them what they wanted: names, places, the truth of where the gang held the boy. He could buy his life with betrayal. But would they let him live? Could he live at all with the knowledge that he had not only stood silent as a child was stolen, but also turned on those he had once called brothers? The question gnawed at him, sharper than the knife's edge, heavier than the brand's burn. By the time the night deepened, Thomas Reed no longer knew whether his groans belonged to his body or to his soul. He was caught between the weight of his sins and the agony of their price. The cabin seemed to close around him, the smoke thick, the fire relentless. And above it all, the eyes of the woman never wavered, holding him as though she alone commanded his fate. When at last they left him bound against the wooden post, bloodied and broken, his mind swam between memory and dream. He saw the prairie, wide and endless, the boy's face rising out of the dust. He heard the mother's cry, echoing like a curse. He felt the forest pressing close outside, silent and implacable. And he knew that whatever choice awaited him, he would face it not as a man free to decide, but as a captive of his own past, dragged inexorably toward judgment. The firelight dimmed as exhaustion claimed him, but even in that fading awareness, Thomas Reed understood that the night was not yet done with him. His trial had only begun, and the dawn would demand more than screams. It would demand the truth. The night wore on in a haze of smoke and blood. The fire in the hearth reduced to glowing embers that painted the walls in a dull red glow. Thomas Reed hung against the post like a ragged effigy, his body trembling with each shallow breath. His wrists were swollen and raw, his skin lacerated, his chest heaving with the effort of survival. The men who had tormented him sat in silence now, their figures crouched around the fire like shadows made flesh, their eyes never straying far from him. The cabin smelled of charred wood, iron, and the sour tang of blood. Every corner of the room seemed alive with menace, though no hand was raised against him in that stillness. It wasn't mercy, but anticipation, as though they waited for something more than his screams. The woman stood near the wall, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed upon him with the quiet intensity of one who sees beyond the broken body to the soul beneath. She had not touched him, not struck nor cut, yet she was the sharpest edge among them. Her presence was judgment itself, unspoken and immovable. He tried to lift his head toward her, to find some trace of compassion, but her face remained as unreadable as stone. The pain in his body seemed to fade before the weight of her silence, for it told him more clearly than words that his torment wasn't yet finished. He drifted between waking and dreaming, caught in a fever born of agony. Images surged before his eyes with relentless clarity. He saw the prairie under moonlight, his companions riding fast with their prize bound to a saddle. He saw the boy's small form, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a cry that echoed across the years of his guilt. He saw his own hands clutching a rifle, not striking, not saving, but complicit in their stillness. He remembered the mother, clawing at the ground as her child was taken, her voice cracking with grief, so profound it seemed to tear the very air apart. These visions rose and fell within him like waves, breaking against the shore of his reason until he could no longer tell whether the cries he heard came from memory or from his own throat. At times, he thought of freedom, of escape into the trees, the cool wind of the prairie against his skin. He imagined untying the ropes, staggering into the night, finding his horse at the stream, and riding until the world behind him was nothing but smoke. Yet even as the fantasy formed, it collapsed. His body was too ruined to carry him far, and the faces of the men who watched him would never permit it. Worse still, the guilt that lived in him was heavier than the bonds. He could not ride away from the boy's cry, nor from the eyes of the woman who had lured him here to answer for what he had done. When dawn's first pale light crept through the cracks in the shutters, it revealed a room unchanged, yet more unbearable for its clarity. The men stirred, rising from their crouches, their movements measured and silent. One stoked the fire, sending sparks upward, while another checked the irons that rested in the embers. They did not speak to him, did not strike or burn him further. Their restraint was worse than violence. It told him they waited not for his pain, but for his choice. Thomas felt the weight of it settle upon him. The decision was his alone. He could hold his silence and accept the death that surely awaited him. He could attempt deceit, offering them false trails and lies in the hope of buying another hour of life. Or he could tell them everything, the names of the men he had ridden with, the places they hid, the path they had taken with the boy. To do so would be to betray those companions, men as guilty as he, yet men with whom he had shared fire and bread. It would mean casting away the only loyalty left to him. But to remain silent was to let the boy remain in chains, perhaps to vanish into a world from which he would never return. The struggle tore through him more violently than the tortures of the night. His body longed for life, for release from pain, for the chance to breathe another day beneath the wide sky. Yet another part of him, long buried beneath years of compromise, stirred with something unfamiliar. It was not courage, not pride, but the first stirrings of a conscience that would not be silenced. He realized, with a clarity as sharp as the iron that had burned him, that this might be the last chance left to him to stand on the side of what was right. He tried to lift his head, though the effort drew a groan from his chest. The men drew nearer, their eyes fixed on him, their expressions unreadable. The woman stepped forward as well, her gaze piercing his soul. He felt the cabin narrow around them, the walls closing, the fire burning hotter. Time itself seemed to pause, holding its breath as he prepared to speak or to remain silent. Words formed on his lips, heavy as lead. He thought of the boy, alone and terrified, perhaps still waiting for someone to come. He thought of the woman, standing before him as both accuser and witness. He thought of the men with whom he had ridden, whose laughter still rang in his ears. The choice lay bare before him, silence, lies, or truth. Each path ended in blood, but only one might carry meaning. The embers cracked, sending sparks into the dim air. The faces around him leaned closer, waiting for the sound of his voice. His chest heaved, his throat burned, and he let the weight of all his sins press upon him in that moment. The decision rose within him like the slow turning of the earth, inevitable and final. Whether he chose confession to save the boy at the cost of his life, or silence to embrace the punishment his sins deserved, the dawn had already judged him. His fate would be sealed in the words he gave or withheld. And as the light of morning fell upon his broken body, Thomas Reed knew at last that his trial was not in their hands, but in his own. The cabin seemed to hold its breath with him, waiting for the sound that would end the silence. The world beyond the walls, the forest and the prairie, and the endless sky waited too. His heart hammered once, twice, and then the moment came when choice became destiny, and the man who had long lived without conscience, at last, faced the truth he could not escape. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself.